Back for another installment of our Witcher breakdowns. We're looking here at the Great Hall in Sintra, and there are a couple of different variations of this set that we're going to be looking at. The first one, we come in, it's daylight, we have some torches and things, but basically everything is motivated with window light. There are a couple of elements that I want to draw attention to. Some of this is going to be pointing at inconsistencies, but I'm only pointing at the inconsistencies to show you where you can perhaps cheat things and get away with it, if you like. We're jumping in, but this isn't actually the first shot in the scene, but I want to highlight this one to start with because we have a behind the scenes photograph of almost this exact shot. And there are a couple of things that you can glean from this behind the scenes shot immediately. First of all, the Great Hall is actually a set, and the whole of the top half has been digitally extended in post. So immediately anything that's happening up there isn't physically happening in real life on the set. Second, we have a lot going on with lighting rigs, and when they're doing something this big, doing it in a studio and building the set and being able to bring in all the lighting on a grid over the top and then manipulate it for the different times a day that you need, it'll speed things up considerably compared to going into a real castle, say, and having to try and rig everything that you need to get all of your different looks on this scale for these wide shots within the confines of that castle without damaging it and still being able to make it look convincing. So it makes much more sense when you've got to do lots of different setups and you've got to move quickly to have it within this set and be able to control it. In the lighting rig up the top, you can immediately spot a couple of things. We've got a skirt going all the way around it. Now that isn't enormous. I'm going to say that skirt's like 1 to 2 feet maybe, but it's enough that you're going to be able to keep the light from bleeding out onto everything around the sides of the set, so you're keeping your walls down a little bit. Helping that, we have the whole lighting grid going on at the top as well. So that's, again, focusing that light where you want it to be rather than letting it fly all around the place. If you haven't used lighting grids before, we're going to be doing some breakdowns with those in so you can have a bit of a look at those. But very briefly, by having a grid-shaped pattern about an inch deep, usually maybe 2 inches on something this big, you are able to keep the soft source, keep the spread of the light over the area that you want it, but stop it from spreading too far. So it effectively controls your light without having to reduce the size or use a collimated light source like a Fresnel, which is going to give you a much harder look. In this instance, the grid above is acting as a top light for the whole room, but because it's so big, that top light isn't so much illuminating the tops of their heads like you'd think a top light would be. It's just giving you a base level of ambience. It's like the room tone in this sense. It's acting like the ceiling. It's just giving that general fill level so you can see how everything in the scene layers up with the other light sources. And that's important because you do need a certain level, otherwise you are just dealing with really stark contrast ratios like shadows, highlights, and nothing in between. But you do want to see a bit of detail here. You want to catch some of the grandeur of the room. You want to see the floor and how all the patterns and the tiles are rendered, and it helps to build the world. So that's an important light source, and it's something which they're going to be using at different times of day to achieve different effects. So here it's just that general base level of daylight coming in. So looking at this big light source at the back, just here, we can see that it's considerably smaller than the top light that we just highlighted over there, but it is still very important within the scene. It's giving everyone just here a bit of edge, and it's giving everything a bit of direction, so we're not just seeing flat top light coming down on everyone. I would imagine that that frame is somewhere in the order of, if these are people back here, we can say, how big is that? It could be a 20. A little bit hard to tell. In any event, that source is giving us a bit of push in that direction and helping to sell this effect just here. We're quite down on the backs just here, so they are in shadow. And then we do have a couple of windows down the side, and those are going to definitely play in this shot later on. The practicals aren't particularly doing anything apart from giving a little bit of reflective light on, you can even see it down there actually, on the floor, and then just helping to illuminate the walls, give a bit of a gradient going up, and help to bed in the idea that this is a rich, opulent space. Jumping back to the actual shot, it's fascinating looking at how behind the scenes render next to the final image, and the final image is much more somber than that behind the scenes would imply. Interesting to then look and see where that line is of the digital set. So all of this around here would be the cutoff point. So everything above that, apart from the chandeliers, actually, if we just skip backwards and forwards. Yeah, I don't know if they've rendered the chandeliers in post or if they've cut them out from that scene and added them in. But that's interesting. Okay, so there's not too much motivation for the light on their heads just there. But it does cut them out nicely, and I suppose that these windows and these shafts that you see floating through the air just there, a little bit of atmosphere coming in, perhaps motivate that. I'm going to disable the color palette for a moment. And you can see that the strongest direction of light that we've got in this space at the moment, if we look down at the shadows here, is this direction just here. Everything coming from these windows is playing hardest on the backs of these soldiers, apart from what's playing on our main talent in focus just here. But nothing really playing on this side of him particularly. It's all on the tops or side of her just there, which is interesting. So let's analyze this close-up, which is actually the first shot in this sequence. We've got a real highlight coming down the back of her head just here. Got quite a bright area back here, which seems like it could be some kind of source, probably a window. Catch light in the eyes just there, and that is motivated probably by those windows that we saw on the left of the previous frame. That definitely feels like it's a square source just here. So if I had to guess, I would probably say that's an 8x8 or a 12x12 placed maybe the same distance away, 12 feet, maybe 18 feet away from her. It's a very, very soft gradient. We haven't got much shadowing at all until we get around to about here, and even then it's a very graceful, gradual fall off. It does feel like perhaps there's something else going on. Maybe that's just a little bit of the set or something happening, but right in the eye just there, you can see something else. It could be that there's another bounce or two, maybe just to eke the light around, but it may just be something on set reflecting. Hard to say. Under the chin just here, we have a very slight shadow. Probably means that the light isn't that far above her head, otherwise that shadow would be much more extreme. And even her ear is actually still pretty visible, so we don't have a super strong contrast ratio just here, like we've seen in some of the other breakdowns we've been looking at in some of the later scenes. This could all be down to black, but here it's actually a very gradual fall off. Real beauty lighting going on, very smooth skin, everything looks very matte. The only reflective element is eyes and a little bit of the lips and a little bit of the jewelry. So it's a very soft, beautiful source. Recreating this style of beauty light, if you don't have a mega budget, isn't really that difficult. You just need to have a really nice big source. There are a couple of ways you can do this. I'm just going to look at one of them. Say that you had a 800 watt redhead, and that's bouncing into a 12 by. So that's 12 by bounce. Just there. You're going to have to carefully position the light to fill that bounce as much as possible. You can probably pull it further back than that. Then you'd have another 12 by, say, of diffusion. Say that was one stop. You can lose an awful lot of level here, especially from redhead, but one stop of diffusion. And then we have our subject over here, and they're getting this wonderful soft light, which is going to wrap all the way around. Now, depending on where you position it, obviously, you're going to find that you're actually wrapping further around or less far around. How far away you are from the subject will influence how soft the light appears as well. But that's also going to have effect on the level, and you've got to balance the level on your subject to get the right exposure with the background and all of the other lighting that you're using for that, whether that's the light on the hair just here, or whether it's the light which is coming in and hitting the haze in the back just there. All of that's going to play a part. So whatever light you're using just here is going to have to balance with the rest of them. And that's why in these situations, you would often find that might be an HMI if you're doing daylight stuff. Now you're finding more and more that might be an LED, especially with the big Arri S360 sky panels. You have the power there to get that kind of level out of it. And because it's a 4 foot by 4 foot face on that light, you could, for the sake of argument, push that through diffusion and get a pretty convincing soft light without having to go through the entire book light setup. You could also put some kind of softbox on the front, control it a bit better, because the one thing that you're going to find as soon as you get into the idea of bouncing and then diffusing to create a book light is that this light leaks out everywhere, so you just get it flying all over the place. Also, you really want the bounce source to be bigger than the diffusion frame, because you want to be able to fill the whole diffusion frame, but you need a little bit of distance between these two. So if your bounce is small, you're going to fill that frame in a less even fashion. It's technical stuff, thinking about the distances here. Suffice it to say, if you just use a 12 by and a 12 by, you'll be fine. You'll get away with it. You can even use an 8 by and an 8 by. It's plenty big enough to do a shot like this. It just means that when you are balancing levels, you perhaps can't step back as far as you would and keep that same soft look. Let's clear all that off and step on to the next frame. Lovely look on this girl here. So it is one to keep in your memory as a good example of a soft beauty light. Okay. Controversy. We love to court it, and here we are seeing some variation between what we saw right at the beginning, just there, and what we're seeing just here. The difference is, in this frame, it seems like they are being lit from the other side. But when we get around to this frame, which chronologically in the series comes before the other, this frame establishes some very, very large windows behind our subjects. And those are easily the brightest things in frame just here. Not completely blown out. We've still got detailing in that stained glass, but all of those windows are playing as very bright sources. We can see all of that reflective light. I'm going to disable this as well. Playing on the floor. Even between there, you got it playing on the windowsills just here. It's catching some of the backs of their heads. Indeed, it's catching the back of her head just there. We still have this directional light coming in, which is a very strong source. We've got a very clearly defined shadow around that area just there, and this is very bright down here as well. We definitely have a bit of atmosphere in this space, and it's just giving us enough to work with. Now let's clear all of that off and move on to the next frame. because here again, we're jumping to a situation where on the backs of their heads, we don't really have any level to talk of. That's all gone down to complete shadow. We can see shadows being cast in this direction just here, and disable our color palette just there. So the shadows are feeling like they're moving in this direction, this direction. We got all of that shadowing. This window now is the brightest thing in frame, and that's motivating the light coming through just down here, but it's still pretty soft on these guys, and it still wraps all the way around. So this side is fully lit all the way down there. We don't have a really strong contrast ratio, but we do have an edge on them, and this area just here has fallen off to absolute black as well. Skip forward to the next frame. Again, a very modeled look on his face, very similar to what we were seeing with the princess. Feels like it's a little bit further around to the side because we're not seeing both of his eyes. So clearly we're definitely losing his second eye just there, but you can still see that catch light kind of in both of his eyes just there. Got good definition mostly, but I will call out this down here. Because in the TV show a character might have a certain personality, you don't necessarily always need them to have a rugged jawline, but something practical you take away from the shot, and something we have to deal with quite a lot on our shoots, commercial shoots especially. Someone who doesn't have an absolutely perfect jawline, you can help them out a bit by taking the light source up a little bit higher. So if the light came in from up here, rather than flatter on down here, I'm guessing, then you will actually cast a shadow, light coming in at that angle, shadows coming down this way, and you will immediately eliminate all of this down here. So it just goes down to that kind of shadow tone just there the whole way out. That, by virtue of the fact that you can't see the variations, will help to bed in the jawline and just make it look much tighter. Apart from that, taking the light further around that way would also give him a little bit more definition in his face. If we could take this area down as a whole, I probably would, and maybe then just try and edge him up here, but I would take all of this down maybe. Just if we were talking about what we could do to make him look a little bit more rugged and mysterious, then you do that. But this is the look they've gone for, and that could still be with the same setup that we had for the girl. Big frame and trying to booklight it, or an LED with a large enough aperture and into lots of diffusion. First shot of the Queen, very similar beauty lighting to the girl in the first shot, calling out the highlight just here, and you can actually see two other speculars in there. May just be bits of the set, hard to say, but definitely getting that fall across her face. It's a little bit flatter on angle-wise, and we've got a slight defocusing up here, probably because the lens they're using, or maybe that's added in post. Yeah. Good use of the frame just here to give her a really crisp line down her shoulder. Definitely stands out, much more striking than either of the other two. Formidable character. We are looking slightly up at the crown just there. It's drawing our attention. And we've got our guy in the background just silhouetted. And he's actually down a little bit further, I feel, there than he was in his close-up shot. But that's probably because he's catching less of the light that's going onto her that was in the previous shot. So yeah, again, book lighting, nice flat across her face, got the catch light in her eyes. Not too much to say about this other than it's really hard to shoot against a window. If you're having to deal with this and you don't have much power available, you're going to run into a lot of trouble if you're dealing with natural daylight and you're trying to get a scene like this. They are working on a set. Because they're working on the set, they can decide that this window is lit to whatever f-stop they would like, so they can just set that level and then work with the lights they've got. They've probably got much bigger lights than you're going to have available to you at the drop of a hat. So being able to balance levels like this in real life is really hard. On a few shoots, we've had to try and balance to daylight outside and have a window in shot, and we end up bringing in, say, biggest lights that we have. We've got 1.6K HMIs in-house, so it'll be a 1.6K, usually through some kind of diffusion because we don't want it to be too harsh. That, more often than not, is sitting in one of our paras. The paras are big focusing umbrellas which push as much of the level forwards as possible. The biggest one we got is 222, which is kind of the height of a man. It's like 6 foot across. Stick diffusion on the front of that, have an HMI in there, and you get just about enough level to compete with a relatively bright day, but not direct sunlight. If you took the diffusion off that and put it into a smaller umbrella, say a 133, then you would get more level out of it. It wouldn't be as soft, but you'll be able to compete with a bit more light. But competing with actual sunlight that's coming in would be incredibly difficult. So when you're looking at this kind of thing, it can be very hard to understand the level of equipment that would be involved to deal with that if it was really sunlight. But being a set, they can be dealing with whatever they want. It could just be a sky panel outside and a sky panel inside, and they just dial the levels so they get the contrast ratio that they need. It's one of the beauties of working in a controlled environment. We're onto another variation of this where you just get a bit of a two-shot. This actually pulls focus between the two of them, and it's quite nice. It's a very, very shallow on the background just here. Just looking at the bokeh just there, it's really completely blown out to nothing, and it's crisp on her, really crisp. But that focus pulls between them as they have the exchange, and we still have that highlight down there. But again, I feel like that's a very similar setup to what we had before. Perhaps he's catching a different light source to her. Maybe if I was lighting this, I'd probably use two separate lights so that you could control it across both of them without having to get everything perfectly positioned. Because if you were lighting her with a, 12 by 12, if he's being caught by the same 12 by 12, the light for him is going to completely light this side. So you kind of need to separate out those two light sources. And in fact, let's draw that out. So if we were having that and it was a plan view, we've got our talents just here and say just here, cameras just here, looking at them, and light source for her, I'm going to put just here, light source for him, I'm going to put just here, and I'd probably then have additionally flagging off down this side, at least a 4x floppy just to cut it off him. With his source, don't need to worry about it so much. If it did catch her, it would be much further down in the level. If it was coming in, it would be coming in that way, which would be the right direction for her, so it would just bed in with her lighting. I wouldn't worry too much about it. But yeah, I'd probably be looking at that kind of arrangement, two separate lights for them, and that way he gets to keep his contrast ratio, and we don't have to balance it perfectly with all kinds of massive complicated flags. Next clip, we got all three of them. We lose a little bit of the drama on her. I feel like this is starting to flatten out a little bit on all of them. They're not really as well defined as they were in their close-ups, but that's to be expected. Yeah, indeed. Look at the difference here between his face in the close and the wide. He's got this really well-defined highlight down that side of his face, as has she. And then when we get to the wide shot, that's completely gone. And indeed, it's completely gone in that shot as well. Now, part of that could be down to the angle of the light, but I just feel like it's a bit of a variation that is indicative of the compromises they had to make. In the next installment, we're going to be looking at the same set, but this time lit for a night scene. If you like this content, please remember to comment and subscribe.